So good morning, everyone. I think we should just get starting. So for those who don't know me, I'm Annabelle Saylor. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute, recently created here at the Neuro. It is my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Katya Braz. Katya has always been a big promoter of the open science philosophy and principles through her whole career, and probably she'll discuss that a bit later, but also a friend of the Neuro for many, many years. So it's a double pleasure to welcome her back here at the Neuro. So welcome, Katya. Katya is a science program officer at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, also most recently created in California. Before joining CZI, she was part of the editorial team at Cell Press for 17 years and was editor-in-chief of Neuron and a publishing director at Cell Press Elsevier. She has been an active committee member at the Society for Neuroscience as a member of the Professional Development and Neuroscience Training Committees. She earned her undergraduate degree from Brown University with a double concentration in biology and European history. She received her PhD in biochemistry from the University of California, San Francisco. And for her graduate work, she worked in the laboratory of Dr. Marc Tessier-Lavigne, focusing on axon guidance mechanisms in the developing spinal cord. So the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative very recently launched a call for applications for what they call the CZI Neurodegeneration Challenge Network. And I know that some of you in the audience are actually planning to apply. So during her talk, Katya will present this new program and its key objectives, and we'll obviously welcome some questions from the audience at the end of her talk. So Katya?
Well, first, it's very, very nice to be here. I was here, I don't remember how long ago, but when Dr. Coleman was your director, and Dave is a longtime friend. I mean, I knew him. He was on our advisory board at Neuron, and kind of force of personality as much at Neuron as I'm sure he was here. And so it's really nice to be back and to meet many of you. What I wanted to do today is to tell you a bit about CZI and kind of what we're all about as a lead-in to this new Neurodegeneration Challenge Network set of RFAs that are currently out there with deadlines coming up. The talk's only about 20 or 30 minutes, and so that should leave plenty of time for questions, and I'm happy to answer questions both about the Neurodegeneration Challenge Network RFAs or about CZI as a whole, our thinking towards open science, anything that you have questions about. As Annabelle had mentioned, just to introduce myself, I'm a program officer at CZI. I was previously at Neuron. I came to CZI both with the desire to kind of take up this new challenge, to be a part of a new organization that's trying to kind of think really about how to both support basic research, but also kind of create a new culture around research in the basic sciences. I was at Neuron for 17 years, and during that time thought a lot about basic neuroscience, but also how to take basic neuroscience and apply it in real-world context, so both translational medicine, but also other kinds of translational efforts. And I think it was sort of in thinking about those issues in a kind of meta way above like the papers that are coming through my desk, it became clear to me, I think, towards the end of my tenure there, just the importance of funders as partners with institutions and researchers in this space, and so that's partially why CZI was such an attractive offer for me. But let me tell you a little bit more about CZI. So CZI was, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative was launched by Mark Zuckerberg, who invented and directs Facebook, and his wife Priscilla Chan, who's a physician and educator. And it was launched just about 2 years ago, December, on the birth of their first child, Max, where they made a commitment to give away the vast majority of their wealth in their lifetime. They had already been doing quite a bit of philanthropy in the educational space, and were looking for ways to expand that in a way that aligned with the values that they had about how to advance human potential and promote equal opportunity. We fund in 3 basic areas, so education, which kind of leverages areas that they had already been investing in. Priscilla is a physician, a pediatrician, but also an educational philanthropist. She runs a primary school in Palo Alto. Education was the first initiative. Science came on as the second, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And the third is an area that we're calling opportunity. You can think of it as a policy space where we fund issues around social justice and opportunity. And engineering I'll talk quite a bit about because I think that's really kind of the magic ingredient at CZI. So CZI is a philanthropy. We're not technically a charity in the sense of how charities are defined in the US, in the sense that we're an LLC. And people will often ask what that means and how does that allow us to kind of advance our mission differently than we would if we were a charity. And what it effectively means is there's sort of some tax issues, and actually we end up paying more taxes. They pay tax on all of our salaries. But what it allows CZI to do is, that's different than many charities, is two things. One is in the US we can do advocacy. We're not doing any lobbying, but we do think of advocacy in all the spaces that we fund and work in as an important way of changing culture. And the second thing it allows us to do is some venture investing. And we're not doing a lot of venture investing in science, but certainly in the education group, that's kind of a more active area. We may do some venture investing in the science space at some point. It's not something we're doing now. So it allows us kind of a level of flexibility that a traditional kind of charitable structure would not. And what I found interesting when I was thinking about joining CZI sort of as a funder is just the different ways that CZI is kind of positioning itself to interface with its constituency. So we're a funder and we're looking for ways to give money, to partner, to invest. But we're also wanting to kind of pull these levers around policy and advocacy to support the areas that we fund in. And we're also, I mean, basically a tech company. So more than half of the people at CZI are engineers. So primarily software engineers, data scientists, within the science space, sort of computational biologists, bioinformaticians. And so really it's this kind of intersection between funding, advocacy, and places where software engineering technology can kind of help accelerate that we think is certainly our differentiation point for other funders. I'd already mentioned that there's three major areas: education, science, and opportunity. Each of them has a lead. So the lead for education is Jim Shelton, who was Deputy Director of Education under President Obama. Opportunity, which is this policy space working on social justice issues, is run by David Plouffe, who, assuming people in Canada might even know who he is. He ran the Obama campaigns and really brings kind of a data-driven approach to advocacy and politics. And science is led by Corey Bargman, who is still a professor at Rockefeller University. She's a neuroscientist who's been working in C. elegans for a long time. She is spending half her time at CZI and half her time at Rockefeller, so she's one of those incredibly gifted people who can do two very hard jobs at the same time. And engineering, as I mentioned, sort of runs through all those programs. Other aspects around marketing, communications, advocacy, and policy, as well as operations, also run through all three programs. We're based in Palo Alto. And for science, we have, I think probably some of you have heard this very ambitious, some would say crazy, mission statement of supporting science and technology that will make it possible to cure, prevent, or manage all diseases by the end of the century. And the first time I heard the mission statement, when I was starting to talk to Corey about this opportunity, I just thought it was nuts. And when I hear Corey present it, she has a really nice way of presenting it, in that she usually in a group of academics will have a bit of a pause and wait for the eyes to roll back and the chuckles and do you really think you can do that? And then she unpacks it. And I think what to me was particularly inspiring is the way that we're thinking about kind of actually meeting this very ambitious statement. And so one thing to point out is we're very explicit about this being a long-term goal. And what's great about Mark and Priscilla as funders is they're explicit about this. We see this as end of the century is 80 years away. We're not looking to kind of pick off each disease, one disease at a time on a sort of track on to the end of the centuries, but really thinking about, if that goal is 80 years away, what do you do now in the here and now to really facilitate that happening? And to that point, if you dial back 80 years past and think about where has translational science gone in the last 80 years, I mean, there's been tremendous progress. I mean, if you think 80 years back, many people died of infectious diseases. We didn't know a lot about cardiovascular health. We didn't have statins. Many cancers were untreatable. HIV/AIDS has come onto kind of the world stage and is now a relatively manageable condition. And so with that level of progress in the last 80 years and with the new technologies and approaches and sort of insights that we have now, what could we do to accelerate the next 80 years? And so the way that we've been thinking about this is sort of through three pillars. One, we feel that one way to accelerate science, and again, I think a lot of people are thinking this, we're not the only ones, is to motivate and support better collaborations between scientists and engineers. But really, I should on this slide also have scientists, engineers, and clinicians. So really bring scientists together to work on big problems in new ways. We see tools and technologies as critical to all scientists. Every scientist is only as good as their best tools, and by promoting really strong, rigorous, scalable tools that the whole community can use, we can raise all scientific boats. And so we think a lot about not just tool development, but also tool optimization, and importantly, how to disseminate and scale tools very broadly. We define tools broadly, so we're thinking about wet lab experimental tools, new IPS resources, new antibodies, but also data infrastructure tools, collaboration tools, so a broad spectrum of tool space. But again, to really kind of think about ways to support not just kind of the developing of the latest kind of gee whiz gadgetry, but how do you actually kind of make that scalable, get it into the hands of more scientists in a robust, reliable way. And then thirdly, as a third pillar, we think that funding science and providing better tools for science is only part of the equation. There are issues around the culture of science and also the culture of our societies and how they support science that are really important. So we're thinking a lot, both through the science group and through our policy group, and how we can build support for science in the broader world, so and hopefully bring in more funds and more understanding of science, but also how we can work within the scientific community to change the culture of science. And here is where we feel very strongly that kind of open science as not just a philosophy, but an actual practice is kind of in our DNA. Everything we do, everything we fund is done in support of open science and with open science principles in mind. That goes from work that we would fund and how we would work with investigators that we fund, to the way that we're developing our software tools, which are all developed entirely in the open with open APIs and usable and scalable to other projects. And so to kind of talk through some of those pillars and maybe show you in these early days some projects we've initiated and how those pillars actually get implemented, I'm just going to kind of walk through a couple areas that we've started to work in. It's still really early days. I joined last April. The science team is still relatively small, and so kind of where we are right now is a lot of projects that we are thinking about, some projects that we've already started funding and working on, and in all cases we really see these projects as kind of learning experiments. They're teaching us about kind of different ways that we can fund and support science, and so we're also thinking a lot about how to evaluate what we do in order to develop programming down the road. And so I'll just kind of walk through some of these efforts. So the BioHub, I think, is a good example of collaborative science, and I bring this one up both also to give you this as an example, but this is actually sometimes a bit of confusion as to whether CZI Science is the BioHub. And so the BioHub is a local Bay Area, so San Francisco area institution that brings together researchers at UCSF, UC Berkeley, and Stanford into both kind of a physical site and a virtual institute. And so a lot of people have heard about the BioHub. It's led by Joe DeRisi, who is an infectious disease researcher, and Steve Quake, who is an engineer. It sort of marries that biology and engineering. It is a local Bay Area site, and so a lot of people wonder whether is CZI Science just a Bay Area institution. And to clarify that, this project is funded by Mark and Priscilla. It's part of CZI as a whole. It's actually separate from the science team that Corey leads that I'm on, but we collaborate with them a lot and we learn from them a lot. And the idea here was to bring together researchers. There's both researchers who are physically located at the BioHub building who are doing research every day, but there's also researchers who stay at their local institutions but come to the BioHub every 2 weeks for meetings and for various interactions to build tools together to benefit from some of the engineering resources. And I think it's a good example of kind of collaboration in a local space, but also with a mission of trying to get those tools out to the larger community. The second project that we've started funding already this past year is the Human Cell Atlas project, and this is not our project. It's an international initiative that was started by Aviv Regev at the Broad and Sarah Teichman at Sanger EBI, that has as its aim to generate a foundational atlas of every cell in the human body. It really came out of these new single-cell sequencing and imaging methods, and is kind of a large-scale, big science project on the scale of the Human Genome Project. It's just starting up. They were starting up at the time that CZI was starting up, and so we've come on as a major funder of various parts of it. And I think the way we're interacting with this project is maybe illustrative of what we would do on other projects down the road. And so one is we're coming on as a funder. What we're funding is actually not the data generation. There's a lot of data generation that's already happening. It's funded from all sorts of places. But we came on to fund two things so far. So one is we are funding the construction of the data sharing platform. And so all of this work has open science principles at its base. The data is going to be shared openly and quickly via this data coordination platform, and we are coming on to collaborate with engineers in the community, so engineers at UC Santa Cruz, Sanger EBI, and Broad, to build the platform and to fund those efforts. We're also funding a set of RFAs. The first is already funded now and ongoing, and the second is just about to be funded. A set of RFAs that are around methods development. And so the Human Cell Atlas really leverages these brand new methods that are really revolutionary but not fully optimized yet. And so what we heard from people in the community was it's actually really hard to get funding for methods optimization. It's usually not a new method, and so nobody really wants to give you a pile of money to kind of tweak a method. And we felt like that was a really important space to fund. So we funded two sets of one-year RFAs that are around optimizing experimental methods and computational analytic methods in support of the Human Cell Atlas project. And in both those cases, what we're funding is the science, but also the programming around those funded investigators. So we're putting a lot of effort into bringing those funded investigators together through meetings for their postdocs and students, but really trying to create kind of a community of investigators that are working on this methods development problem that we hope kind of extends past the 1 year that we fund. And besides funding and building, the third way we're coming on is as active collaborators. So we have computational biologists at CZI, they're staff scientists at CZI, and they're working on mainly sort of computational analytic methods for genomics and imaging right now. So for instance, we're starting to develop a machine learning group that would be working on issues like image segmentation problems, so kind of broad scale problems that are not field or disease specific, but would potentially be enabling for all sorts of communities, whether it's people working on neurodegeneration or a basic cell biologist just working on dynamic imaging in some other context. And so this kind of fun, build, collaborate model, I think, is something that we'll deploy elsewhere. Another space that we're working in, which I think taps in really well to some of the open science efforts here at the MNI, is a space that we're calling knowledge environments. And you can think of this as a bit of scholarly communication, a bit of sort of information dissemination, a bit of reagent and resource dissemination. So thinking about ways to accelerate knowledge sharing and discovery all in the open. And there's a couple projects here that we are already funding. We're trying to stay really tapped into other efforts happening in the community, and so we're always looking for partners here. So one is through our venture arm, we acquired a company called Meta that was a Toronto-based AI literature discovery platform that had been developing a business model that was focused around developing new kind of bibliometric tools for publishers that are AI enabled. And we acquired them. They're kind of dark right now because we're retooling it from a publisher product to a researcher product. So with the idea that with more expansive literature and more expansive content even beyond the literature out there, we all need better tools to help us understand and discover that literature. In the future, with AI and a deep knowledge map of all of the available literature and information, you may be able to generate sort of insights that are testable by AI-fueled methods more than you could by just doing a Google Scholar or a PubMed search. And so that's sort of the long-term vision. It's a major investment. There's a large group of engineers at CZI working on that. We're also supporting and investing in preprints. So we have a supportive grant to bioRxiv to help them scale their efforts. We're also providing engineering support to help them kind of scale some of the infrastructure around preprints. We're big proponents of preprints and feel like they've been very successful in some fields and really kind of accelerating information flow. We see a lot of opportunity for bringing preprints to other fields. Again, in the spirit of some of these challenges being both a combination of technology and kind of cultural social engineering, we feel like for the preprint movement, it's really more the latter. I think there's a whole set of challenges around our reward and incentive system that have made it maybe more difficult for people to get a sense of kind of where preprints can be enabling. And another area that we're looking at is just different kinds of startups that are trying to develop new ways of sharing different kinds of knowledge and information. We've been working as partners with Protocols.io, which is a really interesting protocol sharing platform. They're a startup. They're trying to develop a business model, but they've come on to support some of our Human Cell Atlas RFAs. So all of the funded investigators on these RFAs that I mentioned that are around methods development are depositing their methods on Protocols.io. And so really creating kind of a rich database and platform of shareable methods that will hopefully benefit the larger community. And then to kind of dive into the Neurodegeneration Challenge Network, I think this is our latest example of just an experiment in collaborative science. And it will lead into the RFA that I just mentioned. And so the slide probably is not needed for you guys, but people often ask, so why did you guys start with neurodegeneration? It's the first major disease area that we've decided to tackle. And again, I think this audience doesn't need the justification, but obviously there's a major unmet medical need, socioeconomic burden, and profound human toll. We will all either be patients with neurodegenerative disorders or have a friend or a family member who has one. Many of us will be caregivers. The economic burden, is projected to bankrupt the Western world in not so long. We are coming into this space. We spent quite a lot of time since I arrived in April really talking to a lot of people in this space, sort of researchers, going to visiting institutions, talking to funders to try to learn kind of both what the opportunities and the challenges are and what we could do that's potentially not just enabling but also differentiating, that isn't more of the same, that takes a different approach. And sort of one kind of philosophy that we're coming into this with, which I don't think it's fully unique, but I think it's different than the way that a lot of research in this space is funded, is so we're trying to get the field to kind of really start thinking about neurodegenerative disorders less as individual diseases and siloed sort of funding structures for those diseases, and more as a class of disorders. So thinking about neurodegenerative disorders as a broad class of disorders that span the gamut from the big ones that we all talk about a lot, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, Huntington's, to include, the hundreds of rare disorders that are neurodegenerative, to appreciate that neurodegeneration is not just a disorder of aging. It spans the lifespan from childhood developmental disorders, SMA being a good example. There's obviously genetic causes, non-genetic causes. Some people develop neurodegenerative disorders as a result of injury or even being treated for other diseases. So really thinking about this broad class of disorders and where there are commonalities and where those commonalities break down. We are consistent with our mission to focus on basic science, going into this thinking about this really from a basic science perspective. So this program that we're developing, the Challenge Network and the funding initiatives, are explicitly not translational or clinical. We think those areas are incredibly important to fund, and we hope that what we build here around the basic science of neurodegeneration is foundational for those efforts going on elsewhere. But for us, we really wanted to focus on enabling the basic science of understanding the mechanisms of neurodegeneration. We also feel like that one challenge for the field has been that although a lot's been invested in neurodegenerative disorders and we know a lot, there still are really major gaps in our understanding of basic mechanisms. And so it's not so much that we already know everything, it's just a question of translating it. It's that there are still kind of big unknowns. So our value proposition in this is that we really felt like the field needs new approaches, new ideas, new people, and new perspectives. And that's the mission that we're going into this funding initiative with. And so the concept is to build a neurodegeneration challenge network. And so the goal is to have a consortia of interdisciplinary teams working together on, again, neurodegeneration as a class of disorders with a focus on basic mechanisms. We felt it's important for the field and important for science overall to provide more support for, especially for young researchers, so next generation scientists. I think that's one way of bringing new blood into a field, but also in all domains, critically important for the future of science as a whole. And certainly, I doubt it's different in Canada. In the US, I would say that the kind of early career plight is at this point, I mean, it's on the brink of catastrophe. I mean, I think people really are struggling to stay funded, to be able to do creative science, and, you know, frankly, to kind of stay in science as a career. And so we felt like a large proportion of our aim here is really to work on getting next generation scientists in the field. Again, the focus is on basic foundational science and on mechanisms that cut across disease categories, consistent with our mission of thinking about enabling tools and technologies. This is not explicitly a tool development set of RFAs, and that's not the explicit purpose of the Challenge Network, but we feel that tool development will be an important output of the group. So really, both thinking about ways in which some of the investigators in the group can help us build better tools, but also how we can use the network to help iterate and optimize tools that are out there for broader dissemination to the community. This is just the information about how we're going to form this Neurodegeneration Challenge Network. So the idea is to create, again, this interdisciplinary consortia, a virtual institute, if you will, and we thought a lot about, well, how do we want to create this virtual institute? And one way that I think is kind of typical in many private funders is if you have a space that you're looking to fund in, you then go out and find the best people who are doing the best work in that area. And that works actually really, really well in many cases, but I think it's also probably not the best mechanism to bring new people into a field, and I think presupposes that we already know who's doing the best work. And so we felt like it was important, again, in the mission of being open, to go at this with a completely open set of RFAs. So they're open international RFAs. There's 2 channels in. One is an RFA in support of early career researchers. So this is an investigator award. It's 5 years of funding, quite generous. So Howard Hughes level, $500K US dollars a year for 5 years. That's quite a lot. The idea there is to kind of allow people to have generous funding in a way that sort of rescues them from having to write maybe the typical infrastructure grants that they would have to write, to be able to really promote the ability to do high impact, high reward science without, in the US, I mean, I think typically you'd get into this R01 cycle where you're thinking a lot about just doing experiments to get them done in order to get awarded for the grant that will fund those experiments. And so the goal was to break some of that cycle. We decided to name this in January after Ben Barris, who I think many of you may know, was a professor at Stanford. He was an early advisor on this project, a friend of many of us at CZI, and I think sort of beautifully exemplifies what we're trying to do here. He was a fierce advocate of thinking outside the box, of diversity, of supporting young scientists, of mentorship. This is a mentored award, so there's a mentored component, and I think sort of beautifully exemplifies exactly the approach that we're trying to bring here. He was a longtime neurodegeneration researcher who worked on, microglia, which, in glia in general, which are now fashionable but weren't for a long time. And so I think Ben really exemplifies what we're trying to do with this award, and we're sad he's no longer here, but happy to be able to name the award after him. The second stream in are what we're calling collaborative science awards, and these are not age or seniority restricted. They're intended to be small group collaborations, so 2 to 4 investigators, where one of the investigators is a clinician. And so the idea here is that what that clinician brings to that collaboration is flexible. I mean, we think there's lots of ways for clinicians to collaborate and contribute. What we want is in this overall network, especially if we're bringing in new people from new fields that maybe aren't working in a clinical context, is to make sure that the network as a whole has grounding in the experience of patients and the clinical ecosystem. And so we're really looking to see that the clinician partners that are coming in through the Collaborative Science Awards are going to be sort of active contributors to the whole network and really kind of help the group as a whole really stay focused on the problems that matter to patients and their families. The application deadlines for these are coming up. There's information here about our websites. I had forwarded to Annabelle some more information that she can forward on, or you can find it easily on our website. The application procedure as a whole, we've intended to keep it very lightweight. They're not super long applications. There's no need for preliminary data. In fact, we make it pretty hard for you to put preliminary data in. You're allowed to have one figure. We're really looking for new ideas, new approaches, again, in the spirit of sort of high impact, high reward science, sort of give us your big bets. There is no requirement to have a background in neurodegeneration research. If you can bring something to the table, if you're a cell biologist who's maybe working on, just as an example, protein aggregation, you've been starting to think about working in the neurodegeneration space but haven't had maybe the nudge to do that or the funding to do that, this would be the kind of award that would be perfectly tuned to you. If you're working in the neurodegeneration space and you have new ideas and new perspectives to bring, we also want to include you. I don't want to imply that we're only looking for people who are kind of brand new to the space. But we are looking for new ideas. I mean, I think for our sense of measuring what we do, it's sort of how we measure kind of our funding efforts. If what comes out of this is funding more of the same, I think we will have seen this as not a success. So we're really looking for new ideas. And so what's our overall goal for all of this? I mean, some of this I've already said, but again, sort of bringing new ideas and new people together, building interdisciplinary teams, really kind of learning about what makes collaboration work. We're obviously providing the funding, but a lot of budget and effort is going to go into the programming. And so I think the money, to me, is really only a small part of what I think investigators will get out of this. We are planning frequent investigator meetings for both the PIs, but also investigator meetings for people in their labs. So we actually want to reach deep into your labs. We're doing some of that with the Human Cell Atlas Project already, where we've had these fantastic kind of postdoc and student hackathons that have been really successful. We are planning on things like clinical boot camps or sort of training opportunities to kind of especially help people new in the field kind of get grounded into the clinical practice around these disorders. Our goal is for this network and community to be more than the sum of its parts. And so we hope that individual investigators are successful, but what our goal for the network is to see if there's an amplifying, synergizing effect of the network. We would like you to work with us and our engineers. We see a lot of new challenges coming through with kind of big data, but also small data. I mean, sort of things like new imaging approaches, dynamic imaging that's leaving us with terabytes of neural data, neural recordings. Are there kind of new tools that we can work with you on through our engineering staff that would potentially become tools that are scalable to the community? Again, basic to science is sort of the foundation here, but we see this as a way of creating a solid foundation for later translational work. Our emphasis is on cell biology. We define cell biology very broadly from genetics, genomics, biochemistry, systems biology, you name it, sort of at the level of kind of mechanistic science. And again, really thinking about how we together can build scalable and robust tools and do that in a way that has kind of the spirit of open science infusing everything so that we can potentially change the culture of science to be more open, transparent, and collaborative. This isn't the only thing that we're doing in neurodegeneration right now. This is kind of our major effort. We're thinking a lot about tools to support this community. So had some great conversations here at the M&I about, won't call them biobanks, biorepositories and resources that we too are thinking about supporting or building in partnerships. We're constantly thinking about how to work in partnerships. And in fact, one of the really gratifying things of kind of coming into this space as the new kids on the block is how open institutions and especially other funders have been for what we're trying to do and to be really kind of willing to partner with us on this. And so I think what we envision is that this network is going to be tapped into a larger network. And I think, again, more than I think even the funding, I think the amplifying effect for you as investigators will be that network effect, the ability to collaborate, to be connected to people maybe that you wouldn't be connected to at your local institution. And I will stop there. That is my email. There's also information on the website. The website has an email that's not my email for questions, but you could write either one. It will go to the same place, me. And I'm happy to take questions now.